What does a dog see in the gray fog of dawn that a trained Navy SEAL cannot? They say a dog's senses are 10,000 times stronger than ours. They can smell fear. They can smell intent. Mark Reed trusted his canine, Max, with his life in the deserts of Afghanistan. But here at this quiet American lake, he just wants peace. The problem is, Max knows there is no peace. He knows they are not alone. This is the Lake Haven secret. If you believe in the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog, and you're ready for a story that will keep you right on the edge of your seat, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. You won't want to miss a single moment of what happens next. Now, let's begin. Max knew. He didn't know what he knew, but the knowledge was absolute. A rigid line of certainty that ran from his wet black nose to the tip of his tail. He stood, a 70-pound statue of Belgian Malinois muscle, staring at the trees. The silence of Lost Echo Lake was a lie. The fog that smothered the Oregon shoreline was a curtain, and Max was waiting for it to rise. He had been standing this way, unmoving, ears pricked, body vibrating with a tension just below the skin for 3 minutes. A hand, large and mapped with pale scars, landed on his head. Easy. Partner, relax. Max flinched. The touch was an intrusion, a distraction from the watch. The voice belonged to his man, to Mark, but the command was wrong. Relaxation was a luxury they couldn't afford. Not here. The air smelled wrong. It smelled of damp pine and wet rock, yes, but underneath that it smelled of copper and sweat. Not deer sweat. Man sweat. It's just a deer, Max. Stand down. This time the command was firmer. Mark Apex Reed shifted his weight on the slick stones of the shore. At 40, he looked carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the surrounding mountains. But his eyes, a piercing, exhausted blue, held the weariness of a man who had seen too much. He was here for the quiet. He was here to forget the sand and the heat and the noise. Max ignored the stand-down command. This was perhaps the first time he had ever done so. In the dusty compounds of Kandahar, that command was law. But Kandahar was honest. This place, with its beautiful, suffocating quiet, was a liar. Mark sighed, the sound lost in the mist. He wasn't angry at the dog. He was angry at the war for breaking the dog's off switch. He saw the tension in Max's shoulders and assumed it was a ghost, a memory of the desert. He didn't realize it was a premonition. He turned back to his task, his hands calloused and powerful, fumbling with a delicate, brightly colored fishing lure. These were hands designed to field strip a rifle in total darkness, to check a dead man's pulse, to set an explosive charge. They were not, he was discovering, very good at tying a simple fisherman's knot. The bright pink lure, shaped like a salmon egg, felt ridiculous in his grip. A high-pitched whine started in his left ear. Mark squeezed his eyes shut. Tinnitus. The ghost of an IED, his permanent souvenir from the Helmand province. It always flared up when he was stressed, damn it. He was relaxed. He was fishing. He was at peace. He forced his clumsy fingers to tie the knot, his frustration mounting. He just wanted this one thing. This one morning of quiet before the world found him again. He looked back at Max. I promised you peace, buddy. This is it, no more desert. Just water, just us. Max did not turn. He had not moved. His head was still locked onto one specific spot in the dense, dark green wall of Douglas firs across the water. Mark followed the dog's line of sight. He saw nothing. Just fog, trees, and the flat, gray steel surface of the lake. It was empty. It was desolate. It was, he had to admit, a little creepy, but it wasn't a threat. It couldn't be. Max, heel. The command was sharp, the one they used for "I'm not kidding." Max broke his stare. He turned his head, his intelligent, dark brown eyes locking with Mark's. The look was devastating. It wasn't disobedience. It was pity. It was a look that said, "You are a fool. You've forgotten how to listen." Then Max did something he never did. He let out a low, vibrating growl. It wasn't a warning to the woods. It was a warning to Mark. The sound seemed to cut through the fog. Mark froze, the fishing rod halfway through its cast. Every instinct, beaten down and suppressed by weeks of attempted civilian life, suddenly roared back to the surface. He knew that sound. That wasn't the stranger growl. That wasn't the bear growl. That was the man-trap growl. Mark dropped the rod. The pink lure clattered uselessly on the rocks. He scanned the trees, his eyes no longer tired but sharp, calculating. "Where?" he whispered, his voice a low rasp. Max didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply took one step closer to the water's edge, lowered his head, and stared. Mark's gaze followed, moving from the woods to the lake. He scanned the shoreline, then the middle distance, and that's when he saw it. No, not it. A splash. A small one, then a hand. A tiny hand no bigger than a child's. Which was, of course, exactly what it was. There was no transition. No moment of disbelief. The man who fumbled with fishing lures was gone, evaporated in the space of a single heartbeat. The man who replaced him was Apex. In the second it took Mark to process the image, the small hand, the dark patch of submerged clothing, his body was already moving. His jacket, the heavy waxed canvas, was shucked. His boots were kicked off, the laces still tied. He retained only his t-shirt and cargo pants, knowing the glacial water would try to claim his clothes, his heat, his life. He took 2 running steps and dove. The water was not water. It was a physical blow. It was an ice pick to the chest, 1,000 sharp needles driving into his skin. The temperature was a liquid shock, instantly stealing his breath and clamping his lungs in a vice. His training screamed, "Control the gasp." Inhaling water this cold was a fatal mistake. He surfaced, forcing a violent exhalation, and locked his eyes on the last place he saw the hand. It was gone. "Max! Watch hour 6, he roared. The command ripped from his throat. On the shore, the Malinois didn't need to be told. Max was no longer the anxious sentry. He was on overwatch. He sprinted the length of the rocky beach, placing himself between Mark's discarded gear and the silent, watching trees. He was a sentinel, his head on a constant swivel, his body a coiled spring, his memory clear on the threat he'd smelled just moments before. He knew the danger in the woods was still there, but the danger in the water was immediate. Mark's strokes were powerful, brutal, churning the steel-gray water into foam. He was not a swimmer. He was a machine. He fought the cold, fought the drag of his pants, his muscles already beginning to ache and stiffen from the thermal shock. 50 yards. Too far. Kid's been under too long. He reached the spot. He dove, eyes open in the murky green, searching. Nothing. He surfaced, gasping, frantic. No. A cluster of bubbles broke the surface 10 feet to his left. He dove again, lunging through the water. He saw it, a small shape, a pale face sinking slowly. He grabbed a handful of the boy's jacket and kicked for the surface, breaking the water like a missile. The boy was limp, a dead weight. His head flopped back, eyes closed, lips a terrifying shade of blue. The swim back was an eternity. The cold had set in, numbing his limbs. The boy, who couldn't weigh more than 60 pounds, felt like an anchor. Don't quit. Don't stop. He stumbled onto the rocky shore, dragging the child with him. Max was there instantly, barking, sniffing the boy, looking at Mark with frantic, intelligent eyes. "Back," Mark commanded, laying the boy flat on the stones. He checked for a pulse at the carotid. Nothing. He put his ear to the boy's mouth. No breath. The switch flipped again. He was no longer a rescuer. He was a medic. "Okay, kid. Okay," he muttered, though the words weren't for the boy. They were for himself. He laced his hands together, placed the heel of his palm on the center of the small chest, and began compressions. It was not gentle. CPR, when done correctly, is a violent, brutal act. He drove his weight down hard, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was a piston, forcing the heart to do what it would not. He was aware clinically that he was probably breaking the child's ribs. He knew that broken ribs were better than a dead brain. 28, 29, 30. He pinched the small nose, tilted the head back, and sealed his mouth over the boy's. He gave 2 sharp, measured breaths, watching the chest rise. Then immediately back to the compressions. 1, 2, 3. Max was frantic, pacing in a tight circle, whining, understanding this was wrong, this was bad, this was death. "Heel, Max." Mark barked, his voice cracking with the strain. The dog obeyed, instantly sitting, but he was trembling, his eyes locked on the small, still body. Mark was on his 3rd cycle. The boy was still gone. A cold, terrible despair began to creep past Mark's training. "No, come on, kid, fight." 29, 30. He gave the 2 breaths. As he pulled back, the boy's body convulsed, a weak, rattling cough. Then a violent choking gasp. Water, lake water and bile, spewed from the boy's mouth. Mark rolled him onto his side just as the boy's eyes shot open. They were wide, blue, and filled with absolute primal terror. The child didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just screamed. A raw, silent scream of pure panic as he stared at the giant, bearded, soaking wet man looming over him. "It's okay," Mark said, his voice rough. He reached out a hand. "You're safe." The boy scrambled backward, crab-walking on the sharp rocks, his eyes fixed on Mark as if Mark were the monster who had tried to drown him. The boy was alive, but he was broken. "Hey, I won't hurt you," Mark tried, softening his voice. But he was failing. He was a soldier. He knew how to neutralize threats, not how to comfort children. He was lost, and that's when Max broke protocol. "Max, heal," Mark repeated, but his voice was distracted. Max stood up. He looked at Mark. A quick, defiant glance, then turned his attention to the boy. He ignored Mark's command. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward. He was no longer a K9. He was just a dog. The boy tensed, ready to scramble again. Max stopped, lowered his entire front half to the ground in a classic, submissive playbow, and then lay down completely, his head on his paws. He let out a soft, almost imperceptible whine. The boy's terror-filled eyes shifted from the man to the dog. He watched, breathing in ragged gasps. Max, moving as gently as a breeze, crawled forward on his belly. He stopped 2 feet from the boy and very slowly extended his long snout. He didn't lick the boy's face. He licked his hand. The boy flinched, then stopped. He stared at the dog. Max stayed perfectly still, offering only comfort. Slowly, his body still shaking with violent, hypothermic tremors, the boy uncurled. He looked at the terrifying man, then at the calm, warm dog. He made his choice. He lunged forward, not away, and wrapped his skinny arms around Max's thick fur neck, burying his face in the dog's damp ruff. He began to sob. Not screams of terror, but deep, racking sobs of release. Mark sat back on his heels, the adrenaline draining, leaving him cold and shaking. He watched the small, trembling child cling to his K9 partner. Max hadn't just watched the rescue. He had just completed it. Mark's own body was a furnace, but the rescue had cost him. The cold was a living thing, and it had sunk its teeth into him too. He ignored it. He was a professional, and professionals compartmentalize. The boy, however, was a civilian. A child. He was 60 pounds of rapidly cooling water, and his life was still balanced on a knife's edge. The child's sobs were silent, his small body convulsing as he clung to Max. He was alive, but hypothermia was a patient killer. "Okay," Mark said, his voice dropping into the low, calm cadence he'd used in medbays and extraction choppers. The tone that said, "I am in control. You are not allowed to die." The boy just squeezed his eyes tighter, his knuckles white in Max's fur. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mark said, moving slowly. "We need to get you warm. Right now." He retrieved his dry bag from his pile of gear. His hands, stiff and numb, fumbled with the clasp. He pulled out his emergency kit. Inside, past the trauma shears and the tourniquets, was a foil-wrapped mylar blanket. "Max, stay." Max didn't move, a living anchor for the terrified child. Mark knelt. "Kid, I have to get those wet clothes off you." He received no response, only a more violent shiver. This wasn't working. Okay, plan B. He tore the mylar blanket open with his teeth. The sound, a high-tech rip, made the boy flinch. Mark draped the crackling silver sheet over the boy and the dog, trapping their combined body heat. It was a temporary fix, but it was something. "What's your name?" Mark asked, his eyes scanning the shoreline. "Where are your parents? Is there a campsite?" The boy just shook his head, a tiny, frantic movement against Max's neck. He wouldn't look at Mark, he wouldn't speak. He was locked in a prison of terror. Shock, Mark analyzed, or something else. Mark stood up, his own wet cargo pants clinging to his legs. The cold was biting, but it also made him sharp. He looked at the scene and his training took over. Analyzed the battlefield. Where did the boy come from? No boat, no trail visible from here. No campsite. He didn't just appear. His eyes fell on Max. The dog was still performing his duty as a comfort animal, but his head was no longer resting. His ears were swiveling. His nose was working, sniffing the air. And his gaze kept flicking, not to the woods, but to the spot in the water where Mark had pulled the boy out. "What is it?" Mark whispered, trusting the dog more than his own eyes. Max let out a low, almost inaudible whine. He wanted to go. "Stay with him," Mark commanded, pointing at the boy. Max understood instantly. He nudged his head under the boy's chin, stabilizing him. Mark turned and walked back to the water's edge, his bare feet unsteady on the slick stones. He waded back into the numbing cold, his eyes scanning the murky depths near the shore. The boy hadn't been 50 yards out by choice. He must have fallen in here. He saw it. It wasn't natural. Tangled in a thicket of reeds, a black nylon strap undulated in the current like a dead snake. He grabbed it and pulled. It was snagged, and it was heavy. Damn it. He braced his feet, put his full weight into it, and hauled. With a sucking sound, a large dark mass broke the surface. It was a heavy-duty cargo net, the kind used on helicopters, bunched and tangled. And caught in the center of it like a dead spider was a machine. Mark dragged the entire mess onto the shore. It was an underwater drone. It wasn't a toy, not the kind you buy at Best Buy to look at fish. This was professional-grade matte black with multiple propeller housings and a high-spec optical lens, or rather, what was a lens. The tempered glass was smashed, a spiderweb of cracks emanating from a single violent impact point. This changed everything. This wasn't an accident. This was a scene. Mark's mind flashed back to part 1, to Max, standing, staring at the woods. The threat. They weren't watching me fish, he thought, his blood running colder than the lake water. They were here for this. They were on an op. He turned the drone over in his hands. It was heavy, built to withstand pressure. He was looking for a serial number, a brand, anything. He found it. It was not a brand. Etched into the hardened plastic casing just above the battery housing was a small, stylized logo, a sharp-angled, inverted V. Mark's breath hitched. He knew that logo. It was the mark of Vanguard Solutions, a private military contractor. He hadn't seen that logo since a disastrous multi-agency op in the Marja Triangle. They were cowboys, ruthless, efficient, expensive, and completely immoral. The kind of men who did the jobs the government couldn't officially sanction. The kind of men who left no witnesses. What in God's name, he whispered, are they doing in Oregon? He looked from the smashed drone to the tangled net. He looked back at the boy, who was now peeking out from the mylar blanket, his blue eyes wide, watching Mark. The pieces clicked together with a sickening, final thud. The boy didn't fall. The drone was the target. Or the drone was the weapon. Maybe the net was a trap for the drone. Maybe the boy had set it. Or far more likely, the net was from the drone's owners. A recovery tool. Mark looked at the smashed lens. He looked at the boy's terror. The boy saw this. He interfered, and they tried to silence him. They had tried to drown a child and make it look like an accident. He looked up at the silent, watching trees. The cold he felt now had nothing to do with the water. They were still out there. And they had just lost a very expensive piece of equipment, and now they had a witness. 2 of them. The world snapped, not into focus, but into a different kind of focus. The soft civilian edges were gone, replaced by the hard geometric lines of a threat assessment. The lake was no longer a sanctuary. It was a kill box. The trees were no longer scenery. They were cover and concealment for the enemy. Mark dropped the drone. He shoved the tangled mass of netting and machinery back into the water, sliding it off the rocky shelf into the deep, black drop-off. It vanished without a sound, a secret return to the cold. Deny the enemy their assets. He moved, his bare feet ignoring the sharp rocks. He was back at the boy and Max in 3 seconds. The boy was watching him, his small, pale face a mask of terror, peeking out from the crinkling mylar. Mark grabbed his pack. His hands, though numb, moved with a sudden, violent efficiency. He shoved his feet into his socks, then his boots. He didn't bother with the wet cargo pants. The denim would freeze, but his boots were essential. He yanked the laces, his knots fast and military tight. He looked at the boy. "We have to move now." The child recoiled, pressing deeper into Max's fur. The dog, sensing the shift in Mark's entire chemical makeup, the sudden flood of adrenaline and focus, let out a low, nervous whine. "Kid, listen to me." Mark knelt, getting on the boy's level. He kept his voice low, but it had a new hard edge, a command frequency. "The men who did this, the men who put that machine in the water, they are here. They're in those woods," he pointed. The boy's eyes followed his finger. The child didn't need convincing. He knew, "I need you to trust me." "Can you do that?" The boy stared mute. His only response was to shiver so hard his teeth chattered. Okay, doesn't matter. Mark ripped his pack open again and pulled out his spare thermal shirt. It was black, long-sleeved, and designed for this weather. This is dry. It's warm. You need to get out of your wet clothes and put this on. Now. He held it out. The boy looked at the shirt, then at Max. Max, in a moment of pure, canine intuition, nudged the boy's cheek with his nose. It's okay. With that permission, the boy, still hidden under the mylar, shimmied out of his soaking wet t-shirt and jacket. He pulled Mark's thermal on. It was absurdly large, swallowing him whole, the sleeves hanging a foot past his fingertips, the hem falling to his knees. But it was dry. Good. That's good. Mark didn't have pants for him. He'd have to make do. He rewrapped the mylar blanket around the boy's waist and legs like a sarong, securing it with a quick improvised knot. It was clumsy, but it would hold heat. Can you walk? The boy just stared, his trauma a solid wall. Mark didn't have time for this. He scanned the tree line, the spot Max had been watching. It was 200 yards away across the inlet, close enough to see, far enough to require a scope, and then he heard it. It was not a natural sound. It wasn't a branch snap or a deer or a bird. It was a click. A sharp, metallic, unmistakable sound that echoed across the water in the damp air. It was the sound of a bolt-action rifle being chambered. It was loud, deliberately loud. It was not a prelude to a shot. It was a message. It was Vanguard Solutions saying, "We see you. We know you found the boy. We know you know." It was a taunt, a power play. The boy heard it. His body went rigid, his silent terror so profound it seemed to suck the air out of his lungs. He made a small choking sound and buried his face, not in Max, but in Mark's leg, his small hands grabbing the frozen denim of Mark's pants. In that instant, the boy's fear of Mark was eclipsed by his fear of the woods. Mark's blood ran cold, but his hand was steady. Okay, he whispered. The game had just begun. He grabbed his pack and slung it over one shoulder. With his free arm, he scooped the boy up. The child weighed almost nothing. He was a bundle of sticks and cold wrapped in mylar and a thermal shirt. Max. Heel. The canine was instantly at his right leg. His body tense, his eyes locked on the trees, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The boy was shaking, his face pressed so hard into Mark's shoulder he could barely breathe. Mark needed to anchor him. He needed to turn the boy's terror into focus. He shifted the boy's weight to his hip. With his right hand, he drew his K-bar. The shing of the 7-inch blade leaving its Kydex sheath was another sharp, unnatural sound. The boy flinched, looking at the weapon. "This is ours," Mark said, his voice iron. He flipped the knife, reversing it, the blade lying flat against his own forearm. He held the textured rubber and leather handle out to the boy. "Here." The boy, confused, looked at the handle. "Take it," Mark commanded. The boy hesitated. "Take it. Your job is to hold this. Do not let it go. You understand me?" The boy's small, trembling, blue-tinged fingers reached out and wrapped around the handle. It was far too big for his hand. Mark then did the final thing. He placed his own large, scarred hand over the boy's small one, enclosing it. Their hands together held the knife. "Grip tight," Mark ordered. He put his hand, the one now covering the boy's, on Max's harness, physically locking the three of them together. Man, child, and dog all connected by a single piece of steel. We go. He didn't run. Running was for prey. He turned his side to the woods, making himself a smaller target, and began to move. He moved with a swift, ground-eating pace, not back toward the hiking trail. That would be the first place they'd look. But up the shoreline, into the thick, dark, unforgiving timber. He was heading for the high ground. The forest floor was a wet brown carpet of decay. It was not a trail, it was an obstacle. Mark moved with a fluid, unnatural speed, his 180-pound frame plus the boy's 60 pounds seeming to glide over the terrain. He was an apex predator, and this was his environment. He didn't crash through the undergrowth. He moved with it. He used the dead ground, the dips, the gullies, the shadows of massive ancient firs, to mask his ascent. The boy was a solid, cold weight on his hip, locked in by the shared grip on the K-bar. He was still trembling, a high-frequency vibration that Mark could feel in his own bones. The mylar blanket crackled with every powerful step. Max was the real miracle. The Malinois was a ghost, a silent shadow that flitted 20 yards ahead, then 30, then back. He wasn't running. He was bounding, moving from one point of cover to the next, pausing to sniff the air, his ears swiveling like miniature radar dishes. He was clearing their path, an early warning system that no multi-million-dollar piece of tech could ever replicate. They climbed. The rifle bolt click had been a tactical error by the enemy. Or, Mark corrected himself, a psychological one. Vanguard wanted them to know they were being hunted. They wanted panic. They wanted Mark to run, to make noise, to make mistakes. He would not. He climbed for 15 minutes, his thighs burning, his lungs working like bellows in the cold air. He didn't slow. He didn't stop. He pushed past the pain, his internal monologue a simple driving rhythm. High ground, cover, warmth, assess. He found it. It was a deadfall, a monster Douglas fir, centuries old, that had been ripped from the earth in a winter storm. Its root ball was a sheer wall of earth and tangled roots 10 feet high. The massive trunk, lying at a 45-degree angle, had created a perfect, dry cave underneath. It was a fortress shielded from above with a clear field of fire covering their back trail. "In," he whispered. He slid into the dry, dark space, the air smelling of pine sap and rich soil. He set the boy down, his back against the root wall. Mark immediately broke the lock, sliding the K-bar back into its sheath. The boy let out a small, terrified gasp at the loss of contact. "Max," Mark whispered, pointing. "Watch, the K-9 didn't need the command." He took up a position at the mouth of the shelter, low and unmoving, his gaze fixed down the slope. Mark turned back to the boy. The immediate threat wasn't the rifle. It was the cold. The child's lips were still blue. The Mylar was a passive warmer. Mark needed an active one. "Okay, kid." He dropped his pack. "We gotta get you warmer." He started rubbing the boy's arms and legs through the Mylar, his movements rough and fast, trying to generate friction. The boy was rigid, his small body clenched like a fist. His right hand, the one that had held the knife, was now empty and trembling. But his left hand, Mark noticed, was jammed deep into the pocket of the oversized thermal shirt Mark had given him. It too was clenched. "What's in your hand?" Mark asked, his voice low. The boy shook his head, pressing his body tighter against the roots. "Let me see it." Mark's voice was not unkind, but it was not optional. "I need to warm that hand or you'll lose your fingers." "Let me see." The boy's eyes squeezed shut, but he refused. Mark sighed. This was a medic's call, not a soldier's. He gently took the boy's left arm. "Kid, you have to open your hand." "Let me help you." The boy resisted, his small muscles locked in a desperate frozen grip. "I'm not asking." Mark was a professional. He knew how to ungrip a hand without breaking bones. He placed his thumbs on the boy's knuckles and applied steady, relentless pressure. It was a pain compliance that wasn't pain. It was leverage. The small fingers, white and numb, fought him for a second, then two, then popped open. Something small, dark, and metallic fell into Mark's palm. It was not a rock. It was not a toy, it was a USB flash drive. A Pico drive, barely the size of his thumbnail and encased in a black rubberized military-grade shell. It was the kind of drive designed to be swallowed. Mark stared at it. His entire world narrowed to the object in his hand. The drone. The Vanguard logo. The accident at the lake. The mute, terrified child, it all led to this. This tiny, insignificant-looking piece of data. This was what the drone was looking for. Or this was what the boy took from the drone. This was the why. This was the reason Vanguard Solutions was willing to execute a child on a cold Tuesday morning in Oregon. The boy, seeing the drive exposed in Mark's hand, made his first sound. It was not a word, but a high-pitched, desperate, "Ah!" a sound of pure loss. He lunged for it, his Mylar blanket falling away. Mark closed his fist, pulling it back. "This," he said, his voice flat. "This is why." The boy didn't nod. He just stared at the drive, his eyes tracking Mark's fist with a hawk-like intensity. He was no longer just a victim. He was a courier. Mark looked at the child, really looked at him. The boy was small, but his eyes were not soft. They were hard. He was a survivor. A sudden, almost imperceptible shift in the air pressure at the mouth of the shelter. Mark's head snapped up. Max had not moved. He had not growled. He had simply flattened. His head went low, his ears pinned back, his body sinking into the forest floor. It was the posture of a dog that was not just watching, but was being watched. They were here. Mark knew with chilling certainty that the vanguard team was at the bottom of the slope. They weren't crashing through the woods. They were moving like he was, silent, professional, and deadly. They had been hurting him. They had wanted him to go up, to trap himself on this ridge. He looked at the USB drive in his hand. He looked at the boy. He looked at his dog. He had just been handed the objective. He didn't pocket the drive. He didn't hide it. He held it out to the boy. The boy, stunned, looked at the drive. "You hold this," Mark commanded, his voice a low growl. "You hold it, do not lose it. Do not give it to them, ever." He pressed the drive back into the boy's small, cold palm and folded his fingers over it. "That is your mission," Mark said. "My mission," he slid his K-bar back out of its sheath, "is to get you home." He grabbed the boy's arm, pulled him close, and put his back to the root wall, the knife in his hand, his eyes locked on the dark trees below. The hunt was over. The defense had begun. The silence in the deadfall was a living thing. It was a suffocating physical pressure. Mark was motionless, his back pressed against the hard-packed earth of the root ball. He was a statue, but his senses were on fire. He was listening past the silence, tuning into the micro-sounds of the forest. He heard the drip of water from a mossy branch 20 feet away. He heard the high-pitched scree of a hawk circling a mile overhead. He felt the boy's small body pressed against his side, a constant high-frequency tremor that telegraphed the child's terror. The boy's hand was a white-knuckled fist clutching the tiny USB drive. His mission? Mark's own hand was on Max's head. The dog was a living sensor, his body still flat. A low, subsonic growl vibrating in his chest. Too low to be heard, only felt. Max's gaze was locked on a thicket of ferns at the bottom of the slope. Mark knew the vanguard team was there. They were slicing the pie, moving with professional dispersed spacing, using the trees for cover. They were treating this like a hostile contact in the jungle scenario. Because that's what it was. Then the silence broke. Apex. The voice was not a shout. It was conversational, amplified by a small shoulder-mounted speaker. It was calm. It was American. The boy flinched, a small choked gasp escaping him. Mark's blood went cold. They knew his call sign. "Apex, we know it's you. We ran your description from a hiker you passed at the gate." A lie. A good one. It was meant to unnerve him, to make him think they had all the angles. "The boy is a non-combatant, Apex. He's not your concern. The hardware is." The voice was so reasonable. It was the voice of a man who files reports and gets a paycheck. It was the voice of corporate sanitized murder. "This is not Afghanistan, Mark. This is a blue-on-blue situation. A misunderstanding. Give us the asset. We will secure the child and call in medical. You can walk away." Blue-on-blue. A friendly fire term. This man was claiming they were on the same side, that this was just a messy internal affair. Mark remained silent. He slid his left hand slowly to his pack. He did not look down. He was thinking. "They know my call sign. They know my name. This isn't just about the drone. This is about me." The voice came again, the patience wearing thin. "We have 3 operators and a designated marksman on overwatch. You are in a covered, but indefensible position. You cannot win a protracted engagement. Do the smart thing." That's when Max's head moved. It didn't move toward the voice. It swiveled fast and silent to the right. Uphill, Mark's eyes snapped to follow. He saw nothing, but Max had. The voice was a distraction. The 3 men downhill were the anvil. The 4th man, the hunter, was flanking them, moving to get a new line of fire from above. To pin them in this earthen grave, the vanguard operator below spoke again. "Last chance, Apex. Send the boy out with the drive." Mark now understood. They wanted him to wait. They wanted him to negotiate. They were hurting him just as he'd thought, but they were also stalling him for the flanking man to get in position. He had seconds. He turned to the boy. He didn't speak. He put one finger to his lips. Silence. Then he pointed at Max's harness. "Hold." The boy, his eyes wide, understood. He crawled, the mylar blanket crackling, and gripped Max's harness with both hands. His knuckles buried in the fur, the drive still clenched in his fist. Mark zipped his pack. He grabbed his metal, non-insulated water bottle. He took a single, deep, silent breath. Then he acted. He didn't throw the bottle at the voice. He threw it away from the flanking man. He hurled the bottle far and hard to his left down the slope into a patch of dense rhododendrons. The clang thud clatter of the metal bottle on the rocks was explosive in the quiet. "Contact left," the voice below shouted, all professionalism gone. Instantly, a burst of suppressed gunfire ripped through the air. Pff, pff, pff. The rounds, silenced but still deadly, tore through the ferns where the bottle had landed. That was the diversion. "Go!" Mark roared. He didn't run left. He didn't run down. He exploded out of the deadfall to the right, directly toward the flanking hunter. They burst from the cover. A man, a dog, and a child, fused into one moving entity. The flanker was 30 yards away. A man in gray tactical gear, his rifle up, just cresting the small ridge. He was caught completely by surprise. He had been moving slowly, stalking, expecting to be the predator. He had not expected his prey to charge him. His eyes widened. He raised his rifle. He wasn't fast enough. Mark didn't even have to give the command. Max saw the threat. This was the moment he was born for. The Malinois uncoiled. He was not a dog. He was a 70-pound projectile of muscle and teeth. He crossed the 30 yards in a blur, low to the ground. The hunter tried to aim, but he was aiming at a shadow. Max didn't go for the rifle. He didn't go for the throat. His training was more precise. He launched, his body twisting in midair, and hit the man square in the chest with the force of a linebacker, his jaws clamping down on the man's rifle arm. The man screamed. It was a sharp, wet, ugly sound. His rifle went off, a single deafening crack that echoed through the valley, the round going uselessly into the sky. Mark didn't stop. He didn't engage. "Leave it, Max. Heel!" He ran, pulling the boy, who was half airborne, his feet barely touching the ground, his hands locked in Max's harness, straight past the fight. The K9 released his grip. The hunter collapsed, clutching a shattered, bleeding arm, his rifle lost. Max, a true professional, was back at Mark's right heel before Mark had taken 3 more steps. They were in the open now, but they were moving. The shouts from the men below were confused, angry. They were on the wrong side of the slope. The An Vanguard team was disorganized. Their overwatch was compromised, and their flank was, quite literally, broken. Mark had just bought them 60 seconds. In the woods, that was a lifetime. This was not a retreat. It was a tactical relocation. They didn't run downhill, toward safety and civilization. That was the fatal funnel, the path the enemy expected, the one they would have covered. Mark kept climbing, pushing them up and over the ridge they had been on, driving them deeper into the endless dark green expanse of the Mount Hood National Forest. The ground was a vertical, sucking mudslide. Every step was a fight against gravity. The air was thin and cold, burning his lungs, but he didn't slow. He half-dragged, half-carried the boy, who was still locked onto Max's harness. The 3 of them moved as a single, desperate unit, a 3-headed creature clawing its way up the mountain. The boy was incredible. He didn't cry. He didn't complain. His small legs, clad only in the mylar blanket, were being torn to shreds by devil's club and blackberry thorns, leaving thin red lines of blood. He just held on, his face a pale, grim mask, his other fist still clenched around the USB drive. He had his mission. Behind them, the forest was alive with the enemy. The single unsuppressed rifle shot from the flanker's weapon had been a gift. It was a beacon. Mark could hear them now, shouting, triangulating, trying to regain their cohesion. They were angry. The man Max had hit was a liability, and Mark had just dictated the terms of the engagement. But they were Vanguard. They were professionals. They wouldn't stay angry for long. They would get disciplined. They would start to hunt. Almost. Mark grunted, hauling the boy over a moss-slick log. They reached the crest of the ridge. It wasn't a peak. It was a false summit, a brief plateau of shattered basalt rock before the mountain climbed again. But it gave them a vantage point. Mark ducked behind a waist-high slab of rock and pulled Max and the boy down with him. "Stay," he whispered, his voice a raw rasp. He peered over the rock, his breathing ragged. Below them, The forest was a sea of green. He could see the spot where the deadfall trap had been. He could see movement, 3 gray shapes, moving fast, using the terrain, sweeping up the slope in a classic, bounding Overwatch pattern. They were already on his trail. They were fast. He looked at Max. The dog was panting, his pink tongue lolling, but his eyes were alert, his ears pricked. He was ready for the next command. He looked at the boy. The child was finally, truly shaking, not from fear, but from the bone-deep hypothermic cold that was setting in. The thermal shirt wasn't enough. The mylar was shredded. The boy's lips were a dark, alarming shade of purple. Mark had a choice. He could keep running and the boy would die of exposure in an hour. He could stop and fight and they would be outgunned 3-1. He looked around, his eyes desperate, scanning the terrain. And he saw it. It was a river. Far below in the next valley over, a whitewater river cut a deep, roaring canyon through the rock. It was a silver ribbon of violence, choked with rapids and fallen trees. It was also a highway. It was loud, loud enough to mask their movement. It was wet, wet enough to mask their scent from any dogs Vanguard might have. And it was fast, fast enough to take them miles away in minutes. It was also, quite possibly, a death sentence. Riding that river, with a hypothermic child, was suicide. But staying here was murder. Okay, Mark said, more to himself than the boy. New plan. He met the boy's eyes. The kid was fading, his gaze glassy. Hey. Mark tapped his cheek, a little harder than he meant to. Hey, look at me. The boy's eyes struggled to focus. I need you to be strong. We're going to the water. It's going to be cold, but it's going to save us. Do you understand? The boy gave a single, slow, almost imperceptible nod. Good. Good kid. Mark rechecked his gear. He had nothing. A knife, a pack, a wet dog, and a dying child. He had to get them off this mountain. He pointed down the other side of the ridge toward the sound of the river. Max, lead. He didn't need a trail. He was the trail. He launched himself off the ridge, moving into a controlled high-speed slide down the steep, pine needle-covered embankment. It was faster than running. He was skiing on his boots, using his free hand to balance, his other arm locked around the boy, who was now tucked against his chest. Max bounded ahead, a blur of fur and muscle, clearing the path, his barks a sharp, echoing woof-woof as he scared off a black bear cub. They were making a catastrophic amount of noise. But it didn't matter. They were running away from the hunters and toward the sound of the river, which was growing from a whisper to a roar. The Vanguard team would hear them. They would know. This was now a simple, brutal race. They hit the valley floor, crashing through a wall of ferns into a shallow, muddy tributary. The river was close now, a thunderous, angry sound. They ran, splashing through the icy cold creek, their feet numb. There! Mark shouted over the din. Through the trees he saw it, the white churning chaos of the main river. It was a monster, far wider and more violent than he had hoped. They stumbled out onto the rocky bank. The spray from the rapids hit them like rain. The noise was deafening, a physical force that battered them. Mark scanned the bank. They couldn't just jump in. They'd be separated and drowned in seconds. They needed a raft. They needed a log. He saw it. A massive, ancient cedar, a widowmaker that had fallen and been washed downriver, was now jammed between 2 massive boulders, creating a small, calm eddy behind it. It was a natural dock. There. Go! He pushed the boy and Max toward it. They scrambled behind the log, shielded from the main current. Mark looked back. He had maybe 30 seconds. He was about to climb over the log to find a way to break it free, when Max stopped. The dog was not looking back up the hill. He was not looking at Mark. He was looking up. Mark froze. He followed the dog's gaze. At first, he saw nothing. Just the gray, overcast sky. Then he saw it. A black speck. It was high, maybe 400 feet, and it was perfectly still. It was not a hawk. It was a drone. Not the underwater surveillance model, but a quad-prop Overwatch drone. It was watching them. The race was over. They had lost. The vanguard team on the ridge now knew their exact location. They were pinned between 3 rifles and a river that would kill them. The drone hovered, its high-pitched electronic whine just barely audible over the roar of the water. It was an eye in the sky, an impartial mechanical hanging judge. They were out of time. The roar of the river was a physical wall of sound. The drone, a high-tech vulture, hung in the gray sky, its electric whine a mocking counterpoint to the natural chaos. It was their judge, jury, and in a few moments their executioner. Mark knew he had seconds, not minutes. The vanguard team, guided by their eye in the sky, would be on this bank before he could even form a plan. The boy was a lead weight in his arms, his shivering replaced by a terrifying, limp stillness. His skin was the color of ash. Severe hypothermia, stage 3. He's shutting down. Mark looked at the river. He looked at the log. The log, a 40-foot behemoth, was wedged between 2 granite boulders. The main current raged against its front, but behind it the water was a deep, calm eddy. It was a prison. It was a shield, and it was their only raft. If I can get it free. He saw it. The choke point. The log wasn't just resting. It was jammed. A smaller, broken branch was wedged underneath, acting as a brace. If he could cut that brace, the river's own immense power would do the rest. "Max!" he shouted over the thunder. The dog was at his side, eyes wide, locked on Mark. "Get him on!" Mark pointed to the log. Max understood. He leaped, his claws scrabbling, and got onto the broad, flat surface of the cedar trunk. Mark laid the boy on the log, his mylar scraps fluttering away. The child was unresponsive. "Hold on, kid. Just hold on." He didn't have rope. He couldn't tie him down. He had to trust the dog. "Max!" "Garde!" "Guard." It was their old command. Protect the package. Max instantly lay down on the log, his body a living shield, pinning the boy's small form between his own warm body and the curve of the trunk. A bullet snapped past Mark's ear. Not a peep. A full-throated, unsuppressed crack. They were close. They weren't hiding anymore. The hunt was over. The execution had begun. Mark slid off the log into the chest-deep freezing water of the eddy. He ignored the shock. He pulled his K-bar, another crack. A chip of granite exploded from the boulder next to his head, stinging his face with shrapnel. He took a deep breath and submerged. Under the water, the world was a muffled green nightmare. He opened his eyes. He saw the brace. It was a thick, stubborn branch of alder wedged deep. He began to hack at it, his knife the only tool. The wood was waterlogged, tough as iron. He put his shoulder into it, sawing, stabbing, his lungs already burning. Crack, thwack. He felt the bullets impacting the log above him, the vibrations traveling through the water. They were firing blind, trying to punch through the wood, trying to kill the boy, the dog, the man. He was out of air. He surfaced, gasping, just as a 3-round burst stitched the water where his head had been. He dove again, his heart a frantic drum. He found the branch. He hacked. One more. One more. The branch was thinning. He felt it start to give. Boom! A sound so loud it pressurized the water, slamming his eardrums. A .308 high-velocity round. They had their marksman. They weren't aiming for him. They were aiming for the brace. They were trying to free the log themselves, to dump them all into the rapids to be killed by the river. He surfaced. "Max!" he screamed. The K9 was standing over the boy, barking, a defiant, furious sound challenging the rifles. "Get down." Mark scrambled onto the log, his hands raw, his body numb. The log groaned. The river was pushing it. The bullet had done what his knife couldn't. It was breaking free. He saw them. 3 figures, gray, at the tree line, kneeling, rifles up. 75 yards, hold on. Mark roared. He threw his body over the boy, covering him. He wrapped one arm around the boy, the other around Max's harness. He was the rope. The log shuddered. It tilted. The sound of splintering wood was drowned by the roar of the water. And then, with the terrible, slow-motion grace of a falling building, the giant cedar ripped free from the boulders. It didn't drift. It launched. They were thrown from the calm eddy directly into the main raging current. The log was a toy. It spun, it pitched, it plunged. A 10-foot wave of freezing white water crashed over them. Mark held on, his muscles screaming, the water trying to rip his family from his grasp. The boy was torn from his grip. "No," Mark lunged, his hand catching the back of the thermal shirt. He pulled the boy back, pinning him to his chest. Max was a powerhouse, his claws dug deep into the bark, his body a low, stable center of gravity. Crack! A bullet skipped off the water inches from his face. The drone was still above them, feeding the shooter's telemetry. The river was their killer, but it was also their shield. The canyon walls narrowed. A sharp S-bend was approaching. "Hold," Mark yelled, his face buried in the boy's wet hair. They hit the bend. The log slammed into the canyon wall, the impact throwing them all forward. Mark kept his grip. The river constricted, accelerated. They were a bobsled in a chute of pure white fury. The log spun. The last thing Mark saw before the canyon turned was the three gray figures getting smaller, their rifles useless. The drone was high above, already losing line of sight. Then the world was just noise and water and cold. Hours later, the first thing he registered was silence. A terrifying, profound silence. He was on a sandbar miles downriver. It was dark. A cold, relentless rain was falling. He was on his back. The log was beached beside him. He sat up. Pain, his ribs were broken, his hands a bloody mess. Max? A whine. The dog was there, a few feet away, licking a small, still face. Leo. Mark crawled, his body a wreck. The boy was on his back, his skin a pale, waxy blue-gray. He wasn't breathing. No. No, you don't. Mark put his ear to the boy's mouth. Nothing. He felt for a pulse, a flutter, so weak it was almost imaginary. Fibrillation, don't you quit on me, kid. We didn't come this far. He tilted the boy's head back. He pinched the nose. He gave 2 breaths. He laced his hands just as he had at the lake and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was a machine. He was exhausted. He was broken. But he did not stop. Come on. Breathe. He was on his 4th cycle. Nothing. The boy was gone. Breathe, damn you, he roared, his voice cracking. He gave one final, desperate compression, a punch of pure rage and grief. A cough. It was small. A wet, pathetic rattle. The boy's body arched and he vomited river water. He gasped, a long, shuddering, agonizing breath, and then another. His eyes still closed, fluttered. Mark collapsed beside him, his strength gone. He pulled the boy to his chest, wrapping his arms around the tiny, cold body. He grabbed the shredded remains of the mylar and draped it over them. Max crowded in, pushing his head under Mark's arm, creating a pocket of shared warmth. The boy's left hand, which had been clenched this entire time, finally went slack. The small black USB drive, his mission, fell onto the sand. Mark looked at it. He looked at the child, now breathing a shallow, ragged breath. He looked at his dog, wounded but loyal. He picked up the drive. He knew with absolute certainty that this was not an ending. It was the beginning of a different, more dangerous war. He had the objective. He had the boy. And Vanguard knew he was alive. He closed his fist around the drive and looked out into the rain. Thank you in question. Thank you so much for following the Lake Haven secret all the way to this point. Your support means the world. This story, the bond between these three, was incredible to write. But now I have to ask you, Mark has the drive and he has the boy. Vanguard is still out there. What should his very next move be? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.